Hey everybody, it's Rapid. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be comparing two vehicles side by side, which is going to be a first for the channel. So we're going to be looking at, first off, the American M3A3 Bradley CFV, and second, the Russian BMP-2M IFV. Now, these two vehicles have been at the same battle rating for a while. They're both light vehicles, and they both have autocannons and missile armaments, so they are, at least on the surface, kind of similar, but we'll see how well they stack up as we go through this video. First off, we do have to note that both of these vehicles are part of the Light Tank Master Race. Now, light tanks in War Thunder basically get every class benefit you could possibly want. They can scout targets to make them easier for your team to see and kill, which also in turn gives you cheaper air spawns. They can also call on artillery strike, and of course, because these are both rank 6, they can use UAVs. You can send the UAV up, and you can use them to mark targets either for yourself or for your team to note where they are on the map. So overall, if you are going to be a vehicle, you always want to be a light tank. As far as some of the other features, both of them have laser rangefinders, both of them have thermal imaging for the gunners. Both of them have auto trackers, which is a feature where you can lock onto aircraft to help guide your weapons on them. So in general, these two vehicles do end up being broadly similar on the soft stats, but the Bradley does edge out the BMP a little bit because the Bradley has a commander's thermal viewer, and importantly, it is mounted on this little turret that you see on the right-hand side of the turret. This mounting point can actually be used to peek over obstacles really effectively with the Bradley, and you can use it to guide your missiles, so it does help the Bradley out a little, but it's not exactly useful in every situation. As far as armor, we'll just talk about the BMP-2M first because it's the easiest. It essentially has none. It's not open-topped, so it doesn't automatically overpressure, and the front of the vehicle is at least resistant to heavy machine guns and some of the smaller autocannons, but from the side it's basically weak to everything. And this also creates a bit of a problem because the turret is essentially center mounted. So if you want to go around a corner, you have to basically expose your driver and engine first, and opponents can just kill you through your driver essentially. Additionally, with these kind of light vehicles that have empty space in them, a lot of times what you can do is turn sideways when you anticipate taking a shot, and that way you increase the likelihood that they're hitting something non-critical or hitting some of that empty space. The problem is, because the BMP-2M is pretty weak to 50 cals from the side, this doesn't work as effectively because you can often open up more empty space, but also open up weak points where they can hit you with basically any of their weapons. So, bit of a mixed bag, but overall the BMP-2M is a very weak vehicle. It can basically be killed by anything. The Bradley isn't hugely better, but the Bradley is resistant to heavy machine guns from basically all angles, which does allow it to turn side on to enemies when it knows it's taking a shot to try and increase the likelihood the enemy doesn't hit anything important. The turret for the Bradley also anecdotally tends to be a little bit easier to not die through, but honestly it's not very consistent at all. Against aircraft weapons like rockets and bombs, the Bradley does tend to survive near hits a lot more often. But you'll notice that a lot of the enemies around this battle rating are just main battle tanks firing things like APFSDS rounds or darts, and against that kind of shell, both of these tanks' armor is essentially meaningless. So even though the Bradley does technically have better protection and will survive in some situations, it's not a huge advantage against a lot of the common enemies you'll meet. Next up is the mobility of the vehicles, and the mobility of these two vehicles is broadly pretty similar. Neither of them are spectacularly fast, and a lot of this comes down to again, a lot of the meta of these battle ratings are going to be medium tanks or main battle tanks that are quite quick. So broadly speaking, these vehicles aren't really that fast relative to the main battle tanks they're fighting next to. A lot of times they're about the same speed. The only real advantage they'll have is that they're both lighter weight, so they do turn around, reverse, and accelerate a little better. The BMP-2M does have an advantage over the Bradley in that it is lighter weight, and because it's lighter than the Bradley, it does tend to accelerate and turn a little better, especially in close quarters. But overall, both the vehicles are reasonably agile, and I didn't notice a huge difference between their mobility when playing them side by side. You can mostly get into the same positions and maneuver in the same fashion. Now we're getting into the area where the vehicles start to separate themselves out a bit more, and this is the main weapons. So the main dart or APFSDS round on both vehicles is very similar in terms of performance. You can basically pin the same enemies at the same ranges. Additionally, because they're darts, they tend to have very flat trajectories, which especially when you have the laser rangefinder means picking apart light vehicles at a distance is fairly easy with both vehicles. As far as secondary weapons, before we go into the missiles, the BMP-2M does have a grenade launcher. However, this is basically useless. You can use it to knock down fences, they don't slow you down or don't get in the way of your missile, knock down trees, whatever, but that's really about all it's used for. It can't really damage most enemies unless you somehow hit something like an aircraft, but even then it's a very low velocity grenade launcher, so that's kind of it's kind of an awkward shot. Overall, in terms of main guns, there are definitely situations where you will lose a fight in a Bradley that you would have won in a BMP, because the BMP gun has about triple the rate of fire, plus or minus, so it will do damage faster, it will take out critical systems faster, and it will burn through things like ERA and side skirts faster. But in most situations, they will be able to engage the same enemy. The BMP does noticeably beat the Bradley here, though. You might rightfully assume up to this point in the video that these two vehicles are pretty similar, and indeed, the aspects we've discussed so far, they actually are pretty similar. Like, there's not a huge difference between them. However, the next part of the video, when we go into the missiles available to these vehicles and how those missiles work, this is where you're going to see a huge separation in these two vehicles in terms of what they can do and how well they can do it, and this is why we're going to be spending most of our time here. So we're going to start off with the Bradley. The Bradley uses tow missiles and the launcher on the left-hand side of the turret. Now, this is where the Bradley has probably its single weakest aspect, is that when the Bradley moves above 20 kilometers an hour, the missile launcher will automatically fold in and stow. Now, you might assume falsely that the missile launcher would start unstowing when you got below 20 kph. That's not actually the case. It doesn't start unstowing until you stop. So depending on how long it takes you to come to a stop, like if you can just slam the brakes and stop instantly by hitting a building, you can start unfolding the missile and have it ready in like 3 seconds. But if you have to roll to a stop or whatever, you can be looking at as many as like 4 or 5 seconds. This is a lot of time in top tier to sit there waiting for this missile to come out when any enemy has stabilizers, laser rangefinders, thermals, like at basically any distance, they could just laze you and nail you with a round. And this is really what hurts the Bradley the most. This is also where we have to start talking about the selective realism aspect of War Thunder. So the Bradley does technically want to stow its missiles while traveling, but it's important to note that there's a lot of other features that could be implemented in the game that are similar to this that aren't implemented. For example, the German Marder IFV can't actually travel with its Milan on the mount at all. In order to travel, it has removed the Milan launcher from the mount, which also means that if it wants to fire the missile, it has to come to a stop, commander has to pop out of the hatch, mount the Milan missile, then the commander has to get behind the Milan missile, fire it, and be outside of the hatch for the entire firing time. The game doesn't represent any of that, but it does represent the Bradley's missile stowing and unstowing. And there's a lot of other features like this of selective realism that arbitrarily hurts some vehicles and helps others. Overall, I do kind of disagree with this feature still being in the game in the way in which it's currently implemented, because it makes the Bradley very slow to react at a battle rating where you need to react very quickly. As far as the missiles themselves, you start out with the TOW-2. It penetrates 800 millimeters of armor. Not the best in the world, not the worst. It's honestly starting to wear a little thin up at this battle rating, simply because you run into enemies with explosive reactive or composite armors, and it's a lot less effective. The next upgrade missile you get is the TOW-2A. The TOW-2A is essentially the same penetration, slightly different performance, but not so much that you notice, and it does have a tandem warhead, so it is a lot better at ERA if you're just directly hitting targets. However, the main reason you're probably going to want to take the Bradley is the TOW-2B. The TOW-2B is actually a top attack missile, so it will try to fly above the target and then detonate down into the turret roof. Now, the TOW-2B is kind of an awkward missile to use because the damage is very inconsistent, and also it's kind of difficult to get the distance you want it to be over the target exactly correct, because the missile will automatically try to fly over where you're aiming, but it the default missile, if you aim center mass on an enemy, is way too high. The shrapnel pattern will disperse a lot by the time it gets there, so you actually have to aim almost at the ground beneath them to get the missile to actually cooperate. However, the advantage of the TOW-2B is you don't actually have to see the person in order to hit them. You can fly it over hills, in some instances you can fly it around corners, and you can get some very cheeky kills with it, and especially against light vehicles that don't have a lot of armor, the TOW-2B is incredibly effective. However, against something like a T-72 terms that you'll run into a lot of, that have roof-mounted ERA, sometimes you'll one-shot them, sometimes they'll eat 6 missiles and take very little damage. It's not in any way predictable. But if you think, well, I'll just go to the TOW-2A because the TOW-2A is more consistent, you have to remember that it takes a really long time to get your launcher out. So even if you have the TOW-2A available, it's not like you're going to be able to fire it instantly, so you're mostly just sitting in static positions. In that respect, I do view the TOW-2A as kind of, it's not taking advantage of what the Bradley does the best, and it's putting you in awkward situations where you have to directly attack the enemy. But because you have 2 missiles in your launcher and you have to fire both of them before you can switch, it's not really viable to switch between the two if you see an opportunity. Like if I see an enemy in the open that I can easily score a kill on, I can't just waste 2 TOW-2Bs to switch to TOW-2As to hit them. Vice versa, if I have 2 TOW-2As loaded and I see an enemy behind cover that I can easily take out with TOW-2B, I can't just dump 2 TOW-2Bs to switch to the TOW-2As. Or dump 2 TOW-2As, switch to TOW-2Bs. So this is kind of the awkward part, is you basically have to select before the battle what playstyle you want. Do you want to snipe enemies behind cover, or do you want to have more consistent direct impacts? Now, the TOW-2Bs do technically work with the tracking system for aircraft. However, it's kind of difficult to hit fast-moving aircraft with it. You can sometimes hit helicopters, but overall, not really an anti-aircraft missile, and combined with the slower firing cannon, the Bradley just isn't that great of a substitute AA, although it can sometimes work. Overall, the Bradley's missiles are a little awkward to use, but they can get you some cheeky kills. The BMP-2M is instantly better with its missiles because you have 4 of them instead of 2. All of them are ready to fire. You can fire all of them while moving and guide all of them while moving. Additionally, while the Bradley's missiles were optically tracked, so occasionally you could run into things like infrared countermeasures that would disrupt them. These are laser guided, which there's nothing that currently disrupts laser guided missiles in the game. So this does mean the BMP-2M's missiles are a lot easier to fire, a lot easier to guide, a lot easier to get on target. You also start with a missile that pens 1200 millimeters of armor with a tandem warhead, so you're already off the bat way better than a Bradley stock with your missiles, and you can basically kill any tank in the game with this. Except these aren't actually the missiles you should be using, and this is one of the goofy parts of the BMP-2M. You have a second missile type, which is a proximity fuse anti-aircraft missile. You would think this wouldn't do anything to tanks, and they're basically making you choose between having a good anti-aircraft missile and a good anti-tank missile. But for some reason, the proximity fuse anti-aircraft missile on the BMP-2M can consistently hit a tank, can consistently kill basically any tank in the game. Like, if you just aim basically for the turret ring, center mass of any MBT, whether Russian, American, German, doesn't matter, you can usually kill them in a single hit. And you'll notice in all the gameplay footage, I'm using the proximity fuse missiles to kill these tanks. I'm not, like, firing the anti-tank missiles. And this also means that if you do see an aircraft, now you have a proximity fuse missile, which is noticeably better than something like a TOW at killing aircraft. This means that the BMP-2M just doesn't have to choose between missile types. You can just have a missile that works against both types of targets. It is a little more awkward than a Bradley in that the BMP-2M doesn't reload unless you fired all 4 of the missiles instead of reloading every 2 missiles. So you can get into some pretty awkward scenarios. It also doesn't carry as many missiles. It only carries 4 to the, or only carries 8 to the BMP-2, to the M3A3's like 12. But overall, the missiles on the BMP-2M are significantly better than the Bradleys. They're a lot more versatile, they're a lot more powerful. The stock missiles are significantly better. You can use them while moving, so they're a lot better suited to the faster paced gameplay at top tier. And this is really what separates these two vehicles and makes the Bradley a bit of a dopey support vehicle, where the BMP-2M can just run around at basically any battle rating and crank off missiles and get kills. So the difference in missiles combined with the BMP-2M's gun broadly being slightly better means the BMP-2M is a lot better than the Bradley in a lot of situations, and is significantly better in terms of the top tier gameplay environment where everything is more fast paced and a lot of your enemies are main battle tanks. However, it's not exactly one-sided. In a 1v1 match, Bradleys can often take out BMP-2Ms fairly easily because the TOW-2B is just something the BMP-2M has no counter to. The BMP-2M is incredibly weak to this weapon, so it's hiding behind anything like a hill, a rock, some kind of low cover. You can just fly the TOW-2B over it and easily kill it, and especially with something like a scouting drone where you can mark the target and then fly it over the marker, Bradleys can actually be pretty scary for a BMP-2M to fight in some situations, especially as the BMP-2M can't really peek around without getting shot by the Bradley. But that's not really a justification for these two vehicles constantly being at the same battle rating. The Bradley is one of those vehicles that if it's a little bit over-tiered can be incredibly oppressive to play against because of the way its missiles work. Well, because everything the BMP-2M does is direct attack only, it's kind of hard for it to get in a situation where it's way too powerful. It's very consistent at killing things, but it's also vulnerable to everything constantly. And this makes the two vehicles a little awkward to balance, especially together, and even more so considering the BMP-2M is a squadron vehicle, so it gets used more by newer players. As far as my closing thoughts on the two vehicles, really, if Gaijin just removed the feature where the launcher automatically stowed if you went above 20 kph, I think the two vehicles wouldn't be miles away from each other. The BMP-2M would still be better at engaging things like main battle tanks, but the Bradley wouldn't be so laughably slow that it just wasn't suitable for a lot of maps or gameplay environments. And that really is the big delineating factor, even going across this. As much as it's kind of annoying the BMP-2M gets one missile that does everything and can fire all of them while moving, really what I found was frustrating me the most with the Bradley was just how static you had to be, which significantly limits what type of maps you can play in and what type of play styles you can have. It's not to say you can't have success with either vehicle, but the Bradley is a lot more limited in the situations in which it can have that success, and honestly, I'm not sure if the Bradley was implemented today if it would still have this feature, as we've already seen from things like the Beretta 501 and the VFW, where they've added features to drop down like the sides of the vehicles, or these kind of moving features where the player can control them, and this does increase the utility of the vehicles a lot, and it makes me wonder if this vehicle was added today, if it would still have this feature, or if this would just be a player controlled one. If they still want to use their animation, they could use it during the reload, even though it's not really how a reload drill works, but if they still want to use the fancy animation that they went for, they could use it during the reload drill to show the players visually when the missile was ready to fire. But overall, yeah, that's my thoughts. I really think it is the stow-unstow time that kind of killed the Bradley in a lot of situations. And that concludes our video, everybody. Feel free to let me in the comments down below what you think of these two vehicles and the fact that they are generally at the same battle rating, or at least have been for a while now. And if you did enjoy the video, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Have a nice day, everybody.